The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers, by John Thompson. Episode 4. Thomas Aquinas.
Before I start on the poem Ithaca, say another word about it. Written by the Greek poet Cavafy. He died actually about 1916. He was born in the 19th century. So, as you set out for Ithaca, whatever that is for you, hope your road is a long one, full of adventure, full of discovery. And the Greek discovery is gematos gnosis, full of knowing, translated by discovery. And then he says, Lestrygonian, Cyclops, angry Poseidon, don't be afraid of them. You'll never find things like that in your way as long as you keep your thoughts raised high. As long as a rare excitement stirs your spirit and your body. Lestrygonian, Cyclops, wild Poseidon. Who are they? Lestrygonians in the story were people who Odysseus, his boat landed in different parts of the different islands, and there he met the Cyclops, and the Lestrygonians, and the Lotus Eaters and others. They all had extremes about them. Extreme about the Lestrygonians is that they never sleep, and the description is that the twilight moves into the dawn, and there's no sleep time. So you can actually have two jobs, according to the poet. Then these Lestrygonians, when they meet Odysseus and his men, they devour them. And all that devouring of human beings seems to be that they're diminishing what Odysseus is holding on to, what is to be a human being. And these unusual creatures they encounter are all trying to destroy his humanity. But by doing that, they eat it up. And so the Lestrygonians are this extreme of the total day consciousness. Total day consciousness, no sleep consciousness whatsoever. Now the Cyclops are very different. The Cyclops are these people with the eye in the middle of their forehead, and they also devour his men enthusiastically until he's clever enough to outwit the Polyphemus, the leader of the Cyclops. He outwits him because he asks him his name. And Odysseus replies, "My name is No Man." And so, when he blinds Polyphemus, Polyphemus begins to shout out and cry that he's been injured by someone. Who's injured you? And he shouts out to his fellows, "No man has injured me." So they go back to sleep. And Odysseus escapes. So that's the other extreme. Now this eye in the middle of the forehead, of course, points to a distant past where that was a common symbol. In Egypt, you've got the Urias symbol coming from here with the snake, symbolizing a kind of other way of seeing. So it's a fast way of seeing. So Odysseus has to encounter both. This never sleeping, kind of like us, we never sleep. Blunder's never asleep. And the Cyclops who are living in this past kind of clairvoyant experience. So he has to deal with it. And in the process, he loses a lot of his men. So these are the Lestrygonians and the Cyclops. And then angry Poseidon. Poseidon is, on the surface of it, his enemy. He sets up all the problems for Ulysses. He brings storms when he wants to destroy his boats and so on. And at the end of these adventures, there is, because of angry Poseidon, Odysseus is in the sea, clinging to a rock, the skin being ripped from his hands, as he clings there, and the sea buffeting him, and he thinks he's absolutely finished. And there's the land over there, all his men have been destroyed, all his ships have been sunk. Can he make it? So he sets out and swims to land, and he comes to a river mouth, and the sweet water comes to him, and then he's saved. So he has to lose everything on his journey, and then he finds where he has to. Not yet at Ithaca, but he's on the way. Okay, so that's Ithaca by Cavafy. A little bit of a short recap on Augustine. Last week, one of the aspects of Augustine as a prophet of the personality indicated that this individual living in the 5th century, beginning of the 5th century, when Rome and that whole world is beginning to disintegrate, is the prophet of the personality. And we spoke about this, his autobiography, and how he was trying to make a wholeness out of his life, put it like that. There's another side to Augustine, which partly deals with your question, Bob, which you brought at the end. Augustine believed in predestination. Now, predestination means that before you, at the time you're born or sometime, your salvation is predestined. In other words, there is an elect, the chosen ones, and they live their lives, and already they are predestined for salvation. Now, apparently, Augustine takes this from some statements that St. Paul makes in one of his letters. And that becomes a firm conviction. Now, it seems to contradict the sentence I read out to you about the free human being, you can only be free when all men are free, and so on. And so you see that living in all of us, actually, are very diverse tendencies, not just one focus, this, I'm this. And it is so with Augustine. So he has this firm conviction that predestination is a part of reality, that the elect are pre-chosen. You don't know it, of course, so you better just work hard in case you might be. But you may not. But nevertheless, that is how the world is set up. And he relates that to the nature of the Christ and so on. Very complicated. Now, there was living at that time another individual called Pelagius. Now, Pelagius means the islander. And he came from these islands somewhere. Maybe he was Irish or from the Celtic part of this population. But he became an opponent of Augustine, and he rejected Augustine's belief in predestination. He said, how is it possible? He said, and his view was rather that surely every soul comes onto the earth and we have to work through our own destiny out of our own capacities. Surely that's part of the Christian understanding. And he also challenged Augustine on the whole question of that we are all born in original sin. That is, every little child, however beautiful and innocent it looks, is actually born in sin. And he challenged this as well. You imagine how it is that the Roman Empire is collapsing, and yet Jerome is living in Bethlehem, Augustine in North Africa, Pelagius is moving around all over the place, and yet they're communicating with each other. And so Augustine and the great Jerome decide that they're going to bring this belief of Pelagius to a church council and have it condemned. And one can read just volumes in which Augustine has written contra Pelagium, against Pelagius, and this belief of Pelagius, that predestination is not Christian belief. And so eventually Pelagius is condemned. So that's an interesting aspect. How do one make of that? Now, Steiner makes an interesting comment on this. And he said, if you look back into the past, originally, there was no such thing as individual salvation. For the Hebrews, it was always the people had to be saved, not the individual. And still that persisted in some aspect of Augustine. In the Platonic scheme, then, of course, it's not an elect, but it's only those who are able to enter into this world of the archetypes. Of course, Plato didn't talk about being saved. That wasn't his language. But nevertheless, that was how one moved out of living this trapped life where you don't understand things. I would put it like that. Augustine, therefore, is still holding to this sense that there is a divine ordination in which those who will be saved, and those who are not for that will not be. And that's how the world is set up. So he's still embedded in a past view, according to Steiner. And Pelagius is already sketching out a new direction. But at that time, Pelagius was outvoted, and he was condemned. So the Pelagian viewpoint is something that is already in seed and of course will become a very big issue later on. Now it's interesting that the concept of predestination passes in the Reformation into certain sects of the Protestant Church. Calvinists take this from Augustine. Very interesting that Jean Calvin in Geneva should adopt this, and also the Jansenists in France adopt this very, for me anyway, a very strange doctrine of predestination. So that's another side of Augustine, which shows that he's a man of the future in one way, but he's still living in part of his being in the past. And I think it's always a bit like that. Now, Thomas is born in 1225, and I think Augustine was about 354 or something, so it's nearly 700 years between them. It's a huge gap in time. And I'll just give you very briefly some of the markers in the historical development. When the Roman rule in the West, I'm talking particularly about Western Europe, disintegrates, then you have the invasions of various tribes coming from the Germanic plain into Europe and one pushing the other forward and so on. Goths and Vandals and Lombards and they've all got different names, Avars and so on. And that's a time of great disturbance. Tribal chiefs are always struggling for more territory for themselves and trying to establish supremacy over other tribes and so on. It's sometimes called, and was called, the Dark Ages. But there was one illumination in that dark scene, and that was in Ireland. Some writer has said that it's the Irish who saves European civilization by the skin of its teeth. And that was these Irish Celtic monks, like Columba, Aidan, St. Gall, and all these who lived in their little monasteries. They're incredible. If you go to Skellig Michel, you'll see what kind of conditions these people lived in, and yet they were illuminating manuscripts. The Book of Kells, which is an extraordinary book, comes from that period. And these Irish monks not only preserved, but evolved a whole concept of Christianity, which they then spread out into Europe. St. Gall goes to Switzerland and so on. And then about the year 800, you have the great leader of the Franks, Charlemagne, who tries to bring some kind of political dominance and stability to this Western Europe. And he creates the Holy Roman Empire. So always an easy date to remember Charlemagne, because he knelt before the Pope in Rome to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, Christmas Day. So that's an easy date to remember. So that's Charlemagne. After Charlemagne, then, of course, come to this period of the 12th, the 13th century, where there's a kind of culmination of this medieval culture. And that's the period of the building of the great Gothic cathedrals, the period of the establishment of the rule of the papacy over Europe, the coming together of these great minds, like the one we're going to talk about, and others. And it represents a kind of huge, not termination, but a huge resolution of all that's been going on before. And the task of this period is taken by the people who are called Scholastics. That means they're scholars, but they have a particular orientation to learning, which we'll talk about. Now, there's another event which I'll just mention, two events. In the course of this period we're talking about, there's a whole monastic order, starts near Naples in Monte Cassino by Benedict, and the Benedictine order really moves all throughout Europe, right into the north, and there it sets up centers of learning. And these were not only centers of learning, but they developed agriculture, they developed medicine, they developed all sorts of things. They really were the seeds in which the new culture was going to be developed. And Benedict, who lived in the 6th century, was an incredibly important figure in just bringing that about. And one can see in Benedict and others just the power of the individual, how this man in the 6th century decides, at Monte Cassino, I'm going to create a new order, and the watchword of this new order is ora et labora, pray and work. That's it. And by praying and work, they're going to re-establish Europe. Now, another event in the beginning of the 7th century, Mahomet. appears in the Arabian desert, and a lot's going to change because of that. The Islamic impulse, in 100 years after the death of Muhammad, it has already spread into the Middle East, it's across the north of Africa, as far as the Atlantic, and it's spreading east also into Persia. Extraordinary rise of an impulse born out of this Muhammad's teaching. And we're going to meet that because that impulse is going to meet the scholastic impulse in Western Europe. And we'll talk about that. Just a word about Thomas Aquinas before we talk about what his ideas are and his view of the world. He was born in 1225. His parents were aristocrats, not very wealthy ones, but aristocrats, and he was connected through birth with emperors and kings and princes, so he was a very special person. But at the age of 5, he was already learning in the Benedictines with the Benedictines who were close by. He was obviously quite a brilliant child, so he was predestined for the church, because outside the church you couldn't develop your knowledge and culture, and so he was predestined for that, that's clear. At that time, there were 2 new orders that sprung into being. The Dominican order, inspired by the Spaniard St. Dominic, and they began just at the beginning, about the time he was born actually, so it's quite a new order suddenly appeared in Europe, the Dominican order and the Franciscan order. And they were about the same time, St. Francis in Assisi and St. Dominic in Spain. And so these orders also got the blessing of the Pope, and they began to spread throughout Europe. And their impulses were quite different from what was already established in the Benedictine and Augustine orders. St. Francis had a very strong impulse to work with the poor and the disadvantaged, as we would call it. And St. Dominic had the impulse to teach. St. Dominican order is a teaching order. And Thomas, already when he was still adolescent, decided he didn't want to be a Benedictine. He wanted to join the Dominicans, which were also at hand. His parents thought this was below their level of these new friar orders were below their level of their culture and wanted him to be a Benedictine, but he tried to insist, and actually for a time his brothers captured him and imprisoned him so that he couldn't become a Dominican. And after 2 years of insistence and persistence on the side of Thomas, they eventually relented and he became a Dominican. At that time, there were also universities starting. Some of the early ones in Italy, like Padua in France and Paris, and then later on Oxford in England, the first universities. And Thomas goes to Paris, and there he studies for his degree, and eventually he becomes a doctor of theology, I think, at Paris. And he meets some of the great figures, and one of the great figures of his contemporaries was Albertus Magnus, a friar living in Köln, in Cologne, and these two came together, and they represent, as it were, the high point of what we call the scholastic period. These two individuals, Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas. I hope you'll see why. I told you that after the death of Aristotle, his books were more or less lost, and the person he had bequeathed them to had given them to someone else, and they had eventually gone into some part of Iraq or something like that. I can't remember the name of the place. And they were eventually recovered, and about 150 years later, so for 150 years there was absolutely no study of Aristotle. And then they were recovered, and the study of these documents took place in many of the centers that had a Greek basis out of the fact that they had been either influenced or founded by Alexander and his soldiers in Alexander's 10-year expedition to conquer the world before he died. And these documents were therefore scattered around different parts of the Middle East. Some had come to Europe, but the ones that had come to Europe were mainly on the theme of logic. And Aristotle, as we know, covered a huge diversity of themes, and these were now in Greek preserved in certain senses and studied. And they were actually studied when Christianity arrived there, because Christianity spread very far into the East, but it was also spreading into Western Europe, and they continued to be studied by Christians. And then there was a moment when the emperor in Constantinople decided that Aristotle should, the Greek science, and should not be part of Christian culture, and they were pushed out. And so these documents of Aristotle and other Greek scientists as well, or thinkers, were still preserved there in places like Edessa, and a place that became very famous, Jundishapur. Now, Jundishapur was a town founded in Persia by one of the Persian kings, Shapur, and that became a center of culture, and these Christians who had been pushed out from the Eastern Empire settled there, and they developed their study of Aristotle and the Greeks. And so later, when the Arabs conquered all that region, there were these centers where all this teaching of Aristotle was preserved and had been studied and weighed up and pondered and so on for all these centuries. And this Aristotle becomes for them a kind of seed for the evolution of Islamic culture. And the astonishing development of Islamic culture is partly owed to this impulse that was given to it by the study of Aristotle's teaching. Let's say the 7th century, 7th, 8th century, that's 1,000 years after Aristotle had been teaching in the Lyceum. So it covers many things. It covers, of course, natural sciences. It covers human being. It covers the nature of the divine. It covers medicine, astronomy, mathematics. All these cultural themes are taken up with great fervor by these Islamic scholars, and so they build a picture of what becomes the picture of Islam. The Quran on one side, Aristotle on the other, and how to weld them together. And there were great figures who were concerned themselves with these problems, and I've mentioned three of them, Al-Kindi, Avicenna, and Averroes. Al-Kindi is the earliest one who starts working on the themes of Aristotle. I won't go into that now. But Avicenna is one of the great figures. He was an astonishing man because he's living in Baghdad. He's actually Persian, living in Baghdad, 980 to 1037, active at the beginning of the 11th century. And, I mean, he covered every field of human knowledge. He was a physician. He was a doctor. He had to make money. As a philosopher, you don't get paid. So he was a doctor, a physician. But he was a mathematician. He was a chemist, he studied physics, he was a soldier, he was a statesman. One doesn't know how he put all this into his life. And Aristotle was one of his central studies. And he came to certain views, which we'll talk about. And then, after the death of Avicenna, that part of the Islamic world was taken over by the Turks. And they didn't have the same relationship to that culture that the Persians and the Arabs had. And Baghdad began to decline. And then in the Arabs, the Arabian impulse had come across North Africa, eventually crossed into Spain, and had even at one stage had invaded France and tried to permeate that region as well. And then had been pushed back by the Franks, and now these Arabs were installed in the culture of Spain, with Christian Spaniards, Jewish population there as well, and the Arab. All a mixture of an incredibly rich culture in cities like Cordoba and others. And Averroes lived there. And he is the one that Thomas has a great difficulty in dealing with. We'll talk about that. Now, at the same time, when these Arab texts, Aristotle was now in Arabic. And then you have the whole impulse of the Western knights coming from France and England and Italy and so on to recover the tomb of Christ in Palestine, in Jerusalem, where the Arabs now are. And so you have the Crusades. And in that Crusades, apart from all the massacres and horrific things that happened, there's a cultural exchange. And they discover Aristotle in Arabic. And so in the 10th century now, the 10th, 11th century, they begin to translate these Arabic texts into Latin. And this becomes then the focus for a new cultural impulse in Christianity. And this is a prime element in the development of what we call scholasticism. That's the great scholars before and after Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas had quite a short life. 51 or something he'd lived, 50 years, more maybe. And yet he was incredibly active. One realizes that you're writing everything with a quill on a parchment, and every copy has to be copied by a quill on a parchment by somebody, and that's how knowledge is disseminated. And yet these people were incredibly knowledgeable. Aquinas had read everything he could find of Plato and what was existed of, certainly all that existed of Aristotle and what was now being translated from the Arabic, plus all the whole tradition of the fathers of the church and so on, and the other Greek philosophers and so on. And he encompassed all that, and he couldn't have carried a library around with him, so he must have remembered it. So the human memory was quite different from, I think, what most of us experience today. One of his works are in a huge number of volumes, but one of the center of his work is called the Summa, and a Summa means a kind of, not summing up, it's kind of like that, it's a, not collection even, it's a major statement of his theology, Summa Theologiae, and it's in a huge number of volumes. I think it's 16. It depends, obviously, how it's printed. It's large text. And this is the center of his work. And I just want to give you some idea of how Thomas worked. First of all, these volumes, the Summa, deals with every aspect of the divine and the earthly, the human, in all its aspects, psychological, ethical, ways of living, purpose of life, all these questions, the nature of God, the proof of God's existence, all are there in this huge statement of the Summa. It's presented in a particular way. There are 4 great divisions, and these are divided into, eventually, questions to which there's only one answer, yes or no. So in order to get there, what we have then, first of all, is Thomas lists at each, under these 4 volumes, there are sections which are called articles dealing with a whole theme. Then that theme is broken up into, eventually, questions which can only be answered by yes or no. And that's the content of how it's managed. And there are hundreds of such questions. This is how he handles the question. So, does God exist? Might be a question. Or, is God simple? Something like that. Also a question on the human soul. And he has to get it in a state where it can only be yes or no. So first of all, after he's formulated the question, quite simply, then he will give all the objections to it. All that he's ever known or thought about that objects to a yes. Does God exist, for example? All the questions saying he doesn't. And he lists them. And he says, make sure that it doesn't put in opinions, but people who've got reasons for saying no. So he lists all that. Then he gives his own position. And he supports it by maybe quotations from the New Testament or somewhere else, and or the fathers of the church, and so on. St. Augustine maybe, and others. So he gives his own position, and then the next thing is he gives his response to prove his own position. So having stated his own position and why it's and what supports it, he now gives his proof for it. So he's got to prove it. He adds background explanations, and it's very important to make distinctions. Is it this, or is it quite this? So this important of the thinking element is so subtle, because they're not just bland propaganda in favor of all church doctrine. It's nothing like that at all. It's a very scrutinizing, detailed process of distinguishing one thing from the other to elicit where is the truth. So having made his response, this is where I stand and this is why I stand, he then goes back to all the objections that he's already raised, there might be 5 of them, and he goes through every one, showing where it's at fault, what's good about it, what's not proper about it, and so on. So in a very thorough way, he takes such a question and, what's the word? He does a kind of archaeology on it. He kind of digs it up, looks at it from every aspect, and then presents you with his response. And he goes through that question after question after question. At the beginning of the Summa, he presents 5 proofs of the existence of God. These are interesting, but I won't take you through these. And notice, he's not there to counter atheism. That's not the question. He's not trying to prove, as we might try today, to prove God exists because there are all these atheists around. That's not the problem. He has to show his readers or his audience that the faculty of reason can penetrate even into this world. Proof of the existence of God. And some of the proofs he gives, he doesn't really like. He's not happy with them. And others, the one he particularly favors, he lets you know. So he's by no means a propagandist. He's making thinking into a kind of tool to bring Christianity out of mere faith and belief into a universe of knowing. So after dealing with the proof, he then discusses the nature of God, and then he asks how we can understand the Trinity, a problem that Augustine faced, but he does it in a very different way. Also, the human place of the human individual in this universe, and how the human individual faces difficulties of life, all the obstacles we overcome, the virtues, the capacities that human beings have, how the soul is structured, all these things are dealt with. Finally, he writes on the life of Christ and on the sacraments, and you might think that my description is a thoroughly theological text. It's just dealing with theology and belief. But it's not at all like that when you actually take up Thomas and see what he's trying to do. And now, in order to give you an impression of what he's trying to do, I want to take you through this argument of Averroes. These things are quite subtle and complex. I'll do my best. Remember in Aristotle, he gives a whole picture of the human being, the soul, and how we've got a vegetable soul and it's like an animal soul and so on. And then in the rational soul, there are 2 aspects of it. One is called the nous, which means intelligence, nous poetikos, and the nous pathetikos. And this nous poetikos is the creative intelligence. The creative intelligence. And this is, it's like our word sympathy, it's our passive, we would call it passive intelligence. We receive knowledge just by looking out in the world. But there's an element in us which rises above that, and we are no longer dependent on our senses. We are active, creatively active with our intelligence. And Aristotle makes that distinction. And these distinctions, the Arabs pick them up, all that psychology of Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, they also make this their picture. The problem is with this creative intelligence. The creative intelligence, in one sense, you might say, it enables the human being to participate in the intelligence of the universe. That's a little my language, but I think it's justified. That obviously the world is created in an intelligent way. There's an intelligence pervading the universe, and the human being, unlike the animal, has this capacity to perceive that intelligence. And the faculty that is able to do that is the nous poetikos, this one. This one is more involved in our sensations and feelings and other things, and it doesn't take us that journey, that far. Take the Arabs first. Avicenna considered all this and wrote about it, and it was a question for him whether, when the human being dies, the soul, what happens afterwards? Is the soul immortal? And that would depend, because clearly when the body dies, it seemed to Avicenna that all that we call this passive intelligence, I'll call it that, this passive intelligence must die with it. But what about the nous poetikos? What about the active intelligence, the mind when it's active? Does that also die with us? And in Avicenna, he was not absolutely sure. But he possibly thought, yes, the soul is immortal. Now, when it comes to Averroes, living in Spain also quite just in 980, 150 years later, you see, he defies Avicenna and says, no, it's not like that. He says that when the human being is in this intelligent communication with the universe, if I can put it like that, then it's the universe that's penetrating him from without, and then when he dies, that disappears, and there is nothing to be immortal. Because simply in the course of life, we are, as it were, able to bring into us this aspect of the universe, this intelligence, perceive that, but after we die, then that vanishes, disappears, and so there's nothing to live on. And so the soul is not immortal. So it's rather like the raindrops, fall, and they're all individual, but then they fall in the ocean, and they all merge in this great ocean. So all our individual intelligences are like that. You're intelligent, that's your bit of rainwater, my bit of rain and yours. But when we die, all that rain just sinks into the ocean, the great ocean of intelligence, you might say. So that was Averroes. And Averroes challenges, so it's a battle between Averroes and Avicenna to some extent. And then Averroes gets translated from the Arabic into Latin, and Thomas now has to read this and see, here, of course, the Scholastics are tremendously influenced by this Arabic culture. I mean, Dante, also living in 1300, is still under the influence of this fantastic Arabic culture. And so it's a challenge to Aquinas. Is it true that when the human being dies, then that's it? Simply the body goes, and what we have considered our intellect, our nous poeticos, simply vanishes into the infinite ocean of intelligence. So there's no personal immortality. And it was this question that Thomas felt was highly significant. And so he writes to challenge it. And that's also part of the Thuma, also part of other writings. He talks about what decides that man is different from the animal creation. The only thing that decides that is the human mind, this nous poeticos. Only that distinguishes her from the animal life. And he said, in the language of the Greeks, that is the human form. The form is the distinguishing, shaping activity which makes that. You could say it in all species. You could say there's a form there that makes the lion a lion and the giraffe a giraffe. They each have their own creative form. And he says the creative form of the human, the identifying form of the human, is mind. And that mind isn't involved in what we call the material world. It's quite impossible, he says, for all men to share one mind. Mind in knowing uses no other tool than the mind itself. So the mind in its knowing is not using the body, it's only using mind. The body is there to express it, but the mind itself in its activity is not using another tool like the body. So mind is therefore its own tool, if you can imagine that. It follows that a shared mind would do only one action, that is, all men would be one knower engaged in one act of knowing per known object. So that's his response to Averroes. If you take that picture, then there's only that kind of knowing, and that's not possible. That's not how it is. We have two theories of knowledge, that of Averroes and that of Thomas. The crucial question concerns the immortality of the soul. For Averroes, there's a re-immersion of the human intellect in the universal intellect, as I said, like drops of rainwater returning to the ocean. In this, self-identity vanishes. Such a philosophy stands in the way of the emergence of the personality, which we have considered in the case of Augustine. If Augustine is this prophet of the personality, that personality has no significance. It's simply an earthbound structure that lives for a time and then disappears. And for Thomas and for his Christian impulse, it's absolutely vital that the picture of the human soul as an entity, immortal entity, is safeguarded. Well, there's a very complex battle that goes on between these two, and Thomas is a dominant figure for that period and the period that follows on this particular question. So that's a little idea of how the human intellect was battling over what at that period seemed to be a very fundamental question at issue. Whether that Averroes concept of the soul has permeated the Islamic world, I can't answer that. I have no idea. I think the Thomas concept is certainly central, of course, not only in the Catholic Church, but in Christianity. So, the other question is this. I see out there a sparrow hopping around, feeding itself. Oh, a sparrow. I look up my bird book and it's called Passer domesticus. It's got a name, Passer domesticus. And then I'm going over a walk and I see, oh, it looks like a sparrow. No, it isn't. I look up my book and it's a Passer montanus, I think it's called, mountain. It's a tree sparrow. So you've got hedge sparrows and tree sparrows. Now I look at them, that's the real thing. The name is just a name. Tree sparrow, hedge sparrow, what's the difference? Name. So the real thing is out there. But the question was, that goes right back to Plato, is the idea the real thing or the object, the particular object? Put your question. There are species that are disappearing. Which is more real? Passer domesticus, or that one out there? In the concept of soon there will be no more hedge sparrows. Which is the more real? The name or the particular one that you're looking at? I believe that's a question. But this becomes a kind of shifting scene. For Plato, no problem whatsoever. That one out there is an image, it's a shadow. The real one is Passer domesticus, the species, the universal, we call it. The one which groups together all the particularities, the universal. The universal is real. Remember in the cave, turn yourself around and look at the reality. You're all looking at shadows. And that real world, that particularity of that world is all shadow. Aristotle, no, it's not like that with me. The idea is in the particular. When I look at that sparrow, I see Passer domesticus as well as the particularity. But it's still real. The idea is still real, but it's now embodied. And now when we get to the Scholastic period, people say, is it really real at all? Or is it just a label? Is it just a label you put on something? Passer, sparrow. And the real thing is what you actually real, hear, look at, touch. And that becomes the question of then, when we look at the world, are we just as the reality, just what's given by the senses? And the mind is a kind of constructing process that separates things out for the mind's convenience. So it's essentially naming things, essentially an inner mental process. Somebody came along and decided to call that Passer domesticus. That's his in mind. Now we just follow his habit. Or is there I'm not talking about the word itself. I'm talking about the idea behind the word. Is the idea behind the word the essential or not? And so there arose at the time of Thomas people who said, there is no reality in it. It's simply a mental experience, separating the particulars into universals. So the universal becomes just a name. And they are called nominalists. And the people who follow Aristotle or Plato and mainly Aristotle, because though Plato is still influential, are essentially realists. Now that seems to contradict what you think a realist is. But it's because they experience that the idea is real. It's not real. For us, it's a shadow. It's just an image that goes and comes. Might be there, might be gone tomorrow. But there'll always be the house and the sparrow and everything else. That's real. But then the medieval consciousness says, no. This is the shadow you're talking about. The reality is in what you're trying to call just a name. That's the reality. The universal is the real. It's not exactly a battle, but it's an inner movement. Where do I relate to the world? And already at the time of Thomas, there were people who were coming to say, the sense world is out there, and I am creating groups and connections and relationships out of my mind that's of value for me, but it's got nothing to, well, not nothing to do with that, it's got a lot to do with that, but it's not inscribed in that world out there. It's not part of that world. It's part of my world. So all your general you can start thinking about this. Is man just a name? I mean, I don't mean man masculine, man, human being. Is that just a name that we attach to? Is that a human being? Oh no, it's something else. What is it? Oh, I call it a gorilla. No, really. It's just a name that you stick out there, and it could be, is there a reality in human being? Is there? Could we see it that if these people line us up with all their technology and their computers and so on that they're going to do to save humanity so that we can solve all our problems with a computer brain and so on, will we still be human? Is that a real question or not? So it's in this area, you see, that can be seen as of interest. Essentially, they gradually come to the conclusion, it's these European thinkers, as we'll see later, that the universe is just a name. And one of the proponents of this, another Englishman called William of Ockham. Ockham's in Surrey somewhere, I think. He may have come from there. And he absolutely stood up for this idea that universals, as we call them, are simply labels we attach to particulars. And the real thing is the particular. The particular individual I'm dealing with, and we just group them because they've got similarities of appearance and intelligence and so on. So that's this battle between realism and... Battle is maybe not the right word. It's a really shifting consciousness. And as the world, you get more separated from the world, then that becomes the real thing. The more you're in tune with the world, or the world's around you, and you're connected with it, then the real world I can perceive with my thinking. So there's a separation going on like this, it's getting a bit more distant, and now that's the real world, and I've just got names going on in my head. Now to sum up, I'm not just going to give an example of how Thomas's thinking is not just something that happened 800 years ago and it's a bit irrelevant except to people who go to church. It actually comes up in essays now on Big Bang Theory. They start looking up the Summa Theologiae. How did this man think about it? And one of the problems in the Big Bang Theory is it talks about, all right, we go back in time, and then there was a big explosion out of a singularity, as they call it. As big. Somebody said it must have been as big as a softball. Imagine all the universe gathered into a softball, and then it starts buzzing, and they've now worked out where it was at an infinitely small part of a second after the Big Bang, but there's a bit in between they haven't sorted out yet. And after that, all these infinite galaxies and creations and the whole of humanity and planets and suns and all that, it's all emerged out of this little softball. Okay? It's all about beginnings. Big Bang Theory is about beginning. Thomas in the Summa talks about creation and change. What is the difference in creation and change? One of the problems, I think, in trying to understand Thomas is that we import into it many assumptions that we make that belong to our culture. We think if we see any phenomenon, we can find a cause. There's something causing that. And that can go into all aspects of life, not only why a stone gets warm when the sun comes out, but why somebody has a tendency to alcohol or something like that. We look for the gene or whatever. We're always looking for something that will cause an event. That's our typical mental attitude. That was not at all there with the Scholastics. They're not looking for that kind. They acknowledge it, of course. They're quite aware of these things, that the sun warms the stone and so on. But that's not their characteristic understanding of how the universe is put together. We want to know how things work, and Thomas has different presuppositions. Causality, which is one thing causing another, was understood quite differently by him as it was by Aristotle. You may remember in Aristotle there were 4 causations: the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final cause, so that everything had, apart from the other cause, a final cause. That means what's it for, you know? But Thomas's is not quite like Aristotle's, I'll try to make clear. For Thomas, the first place is not the same as the first move in time. Now, the first move in time is in the process, and this first foundation is conceived as underlying the whole process as an idea of... Now, let me get it clear. It's quite complex. I'm going to use my text. Creation is an act which brings about the appearance, the existence of a thing, whatever it is. To understand creation, it's important to realize that nothing of what has come about to exist exists prior in the process of being created. In other words, changing something is merely moving that particular existence into another form. Aristotle and these people talk about what's in potential and what becomes actualized. So that a plant, you see it a small seedlings of the open, they're in potentia, they're not the full plant, and that actualizes itself and becomes the plant. So that's a process. Now that's the process of change. And you can see change of color in leaf and all that. It's all due to some agent is working on it, bringing about difference in that existing thing. Now creation is not that. Creation is bringing into existence that which did not exist before. And for Thomas, the important thing also is that this is not an initial thing and then finish. This creation process is a continuous being in that which is existing. I'll use that as an example. For God to create the world is not just, that's it, I've done it, I can go home now. It's quite different. It is an act of creation is actually to be within in every particularity that which has become existing. Now, Thomas sees a quite distinct difference between the process of change and the process of creation. Now, in all physical theory, they are simply trying to take us back, following the laws of physics that we know, following the basic particles that we've discovered, to a previous state. And so it's all a process of change, but nothing to do with, in Thomas's word, creation. And for Thomas, the created world is that in which the creator is permanently, in some sense, active. It's not changes, I've done that, now I go on to the next thing. It's like a relay race. You pass your torch on to the next one, and then he does the running, and then he passes it on. That's change. But creation is not that. And these passages where Thomas is trying to unfold this quite subtle and quite profound concept of what creation is, transforms the way of looking at the world, because we're all in relay races. We're all just change. Everything's just change. But there's no actual understanding of creation. That's why the Big Bang theorists are starting to read Thomas Aquinas. Okay, Aristotle, you see, felt that all the Greeks actually couldn't conceive of any beginning in the sense of an original creation. The philosophers I'm talking about. All mythologies have a beginning in some form. The gods do it in some way. Something totally new comes about, not just a change. But the Greeks, all the thinkers, tended to think there can't be any original beginning. They are all for an eternal universe that goes on, it's been on, going on forever, and it'll go on forever. And of course the Christian doctrine of God creating the earth in 6 days and so on, the world in 6 days, that was a focal point, however you understand it, a focal point for the Scholastics and all the Christian impulse. So it's how to merge this idea of a beginning, a created universe, with the Aristotelian ideas, was one of the tasks of these philosophers. In this argument about what I've just been talking about, Thomas makes this: not only does faith hold that there is creation, but reason also demonstrates it. Reason demonstrates that that creation is actually the bringing into being of a new existence and permanently sustained by that which created it. Well, Thomas is one of the huge figures of this scholastic period. In him you see the stream of Aristotle and the Greeks flowing together with this Christianity coming from the Revelations, and how Augustine and the other fathers of the church tried to evolve that in terms of It's understanding the relationship between the perceived world and the revealed world and so on. We've spoken about that. And Thomas makes a very strenuous effort to actually distinguish the fields that you can say belong to faith and those that belong to reason. He doesn't want to confuse himself, that slip faith into reason without, he's very conscious of where one belongs and the other. And then a last statement is that, if you try to live in the world of the Scholastics, it's a very different one from ours. The Scholastics are still living in this world as realists, that the world out there is a text I can read if I can learn the language. It's really a text. I don't have to go into a laboratory. They did do experiments, by the way, but I don't have to do in a laboratory and have cloud chambers and CERN and all that to understand how the thing it was. There's a text out there, and I must learn to read it. And so they were reading a text. You get phrases like this in Thomas. God does not permit, for example. God does not permit. Now that means there's an author of that text. So he's got a text and he's got an author. But we don't have any text and we don't have any author. So we have to start somewhere else. And so that, I think, gives you a little picture, I hope, of what's happening in the 12th, 13th century in Europe with a figure like Thomas.
The next episode is on Bacon, Descartes, and Spinoza.